Hey, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate it because, we're just a little pissant show in the bottom of the South Island, but we like
Right.
talking interesting things and we have interesting people on. And I'm glad we're finally being able to connect with someone from National to come have a chat with us from the perspective of the world from a national, point of view, so to
Oh,
speak.
very welcome. And from small acorns, big oaks grow. So you never know where you might be in a couple of years.
Fingers crossed, yeah. I want to know from you, I want to talk a little bit about inflation.
Mm.
And I guess we talk about it. So this show, which you don't know anything about, which is all good, is sort of a news conversation show. So there's
Yeah.
often two, sometimes three of us on for an hour, talking around the issues of the day, bringing up news items, talking to them, playing clips, saying what did we think about that. That's sort of what we do.
Yeah.
It's always fun to have a politician on. We had David Clark on last week talking about the grocery commissioner. We've had
Yeah.
Martima on a few times, and because then we can say to you guys directly rather than us commentating it, from the halls of power, so to speak, or the crossbenches of power, whichever the case may be. What does it mean? So I want to talk to you about inflation. Of course, there was an announcement today, New Zealand at 7.3%. Nicola Willis has come out saying inflation has now had a grip on the economy and the government needs a long-term plan, not a band-aid solution to fight inflation. So the obvious question to a National Party MP is what should if you were in the halls of power, if you were on the 9th floor, what would the long-term plan be? What could we expect from a national government acknowledging we're only really 14 months out from making that decision?
Yeah. Well, look, the government needs to make that decision now because what we do know is that any long-term plan takes about 18 months to bed in, particularly when you're dealing with cost of living and inflation issues. So they do need to act. It's too late to say, well, they should have been doing a few of these things a year ago. But inflation primarily exists because there's not enough stuff and people are having to pay more for it. It's a simple
Right.
supply and demand equation.
Right.
And one of the biggest issues with suppliers with people, we just don't have enough skilled labor to be able to meet the demand for an economy that, despite the challenges we've got, is actually bouncing along in a simmering way. It's if you think about our construction sector, hospitality, now that the borders are reopened, there is a high level of demand for labor, for people. And the government has steadfastly refused to calibrate its immigration policy to enable the sort of labor that business needs to come in. As a consequence, we're seeing 10, 11, 12% increases in salaries for those staff. Now, if you're one of those staff, that's great. But those very same people are having to pay significantly more at the petrol pump, at the supermarket, and in their rental and mortgage. So it becomes a vicious cycle of pay increases and then cost increases and then pay increases again. And that's what worries me, that we're actually starting to get into that vicious cycle. The other thing the government can do is to turn down its own spending tap. It has, through COVID, and using the guise of COVID, frankly, spent an inordinate amount of money over the last 2 years that it claims was necessary to maintain the economy. Well, in some ways that's true, particularly when it comes to the wage subsidies that were necessary to sustain jobs, and good on them, that was the right thing to do. But amongst the more than $60 billion of extra spending that they've undertaken over the last couple of years is billions and billions of dollars of spending that by any measure can't be related to COVID. We're seeing that plus a very big increase of about 15,000 in bureaucrats in Wellington that hasn't added to a single extra teacher or undertaken a single elective surgery. So a lot of that spending can be tapered off as well. So there's a lot the government can be doing. It seems steadfastly of the view that their way is the only way. We disagree.
Okay. Great. Now let's get into some of these things and break them down a bit further that you've mentioned. I was jotting away. One of the things we don't do here, Michael, is we don't like to, unless you're, and this is not because it was him, but unless you're David Seymour and you've got a plane to catch, might have to cut in a few times then, but I want to give you the chance to share your answers in full. And then as long as you're cool with it, we go back and we have a look at it. So you talked about supply and demand, and you talked about then basically workers. So what I hear you saying is there's not enough workers, hence supply and demand, that's driving inflation. And then you said, and then they're paying more at the petrol pump. Just that one point there. Can you explain to me how, I'm sure you know it. We all know it well. Belmac number 7 up there in Roseland or something like that is struggling to get staff. How does that change the price or how does that cause the price at the pumps to go up? Because you've connected those two things, and I'm just wondering how they're connected.
Well, labour is a part of any supply of a good or service, right? So yes, we talk about the price of a barrel of oil. Indeed, that's actually come down from about $120 down US to about $100. But that's only one component part of the retail price of fuel. The fuel itself has to be transported. So, that truck driver that's moving that fuel around the country, the person that's serving you behind the counter, the plethora of other staff that go into the preparation and delivery of any good or service around the country.
But we don't have a fuel shortage, and we don't have a tanker delivery driver shortage. So I'm just
Yeah, we
wondering
do. Absolutely, we do, Pat. We
Okay.
have significant driver shortages. That's one of the reasons the sorts of items that we get are taking much longer to get to you, whether it's in the stores or delivered to your home.
Would it be fair to say, though, that we don't have a tanker driver shortage enough for petrol stations to be? I mean, I haven't seen petrol stations running out of petrol, for example. So I'm still trying to figure out how not enough people to employ changes the dollar figure at the pump, which is two things you connected before. It seems that all the petrol stations have plenty of fuel. Look, I don't disagree with you about what happened. Was the reason that there's such a difference between, say, 2008 and now to do with fuel prices is that when COVID came, all the fuel producers ramped down their service, ramped down their production of fuel, and they haven't increased them again. Hence, their fuel's being worth more to them per litre because there's less of it. But we don't actually have a fuel shortage per se. We're not running short on fuel. No one's running out of fuel.
If the point you're making is that there are some factors that the government does not control, I'll accept that.
Yep.
But what I'm saying is there are a heck of a lot of things that they do control.
Such as,
I talked about construction. I'll go back to the issue on construction costs. It's not just labor. I could have also added things like the supply of jib. And one of the reasons why we're so short of jib is because the government did not allow Fletchers to manufacture it during the COVID crisis, even though they believed that could be done safely. So there's a number of things that all contribute to an inflationary cycle. Some are controllable by government, some are not. What we're saying is, for the things that they do control, they should be acting in order to take the pressure off Kiwis.
They don't call it jib in America. What do they call it? Sheetrock. Sheetrock or something like that. Yeah.
Drywall, Australia.
Drywall. I mean, maybe not. I'm not saying it's an exact parallel. That seems to be a worldwide issue at the moment for some reason, the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as you say, maybe there's a difference in New Zealand because we produce it here and it could have supplied here more easily. I am interested, though, as well, to ask you, I think the idea of an opposition in a well-functioning democracy is to hold the government to account, right? Yep. Completely what you guys should be doing and are doing, but there's also the idea of, as a voter and a member of the public, I want to see my politicians be most effective in what they do for the betterment of me and my community, be that the country or be that my neighborhood or be that my family or whatever it is. And I wonder about like the worldwide issues. So, for example, I had a look, and I'll bring it up to show you if you like. Just before we came on, where's my little thing? Here it is. Like inflation in general, right? This is, I got to just bring my screen up, excuse me. We can share screens here and we do this so people can see what we're talking about. Looking at inflation around the world at the moment, I think it was announced today that the UK was at 9.1%. The US is at 9.1%. The European Union's at 8.6%. Canada's at 7.7%. So on a OECD or world scale, it doesn't seem New Zealand's in a terrible place. And I'm wondering if we're seeing these things around the world, if we are, and like the sheetrock or the jib stop or the whatever, or the petrol prices everywhere being up around the world, or it being hard to find people to employ everywhere in the world, it seems to be an issue for places that don't have to have an international flight to get here, like the countries within the European Union. And I guess I'm kind of throwing it back to you. You've started the conversation about what this government can do, but if these are things that we're seeing around the world, if National was in, for example, what is it that you could actually change within the country that's not being seen as a trend around the world? Australia at the moment at 5.1%, but they say that's going to be going up in a couple of months. That's from a March figure. What actually, there's an economist who also says that I was going to play a little clip of, but I couldn't find the clip from News Hub, who says the main people responsible for inflation is the Reserve Bank. And one of the things they did was 18 months ago, they actually projected there'd be more unemployed people than there are. And that's also one of the driving factors of inflation. So I want to hear, and I'm not challenging you in this way,
Well,
solutions to us.
Raised the whole.
Raised,
well, I'll try and encapsulate that in three sort of key areas.
Yeah, go for it.
Two relating to the rest of the world and one relating to our own Reserve Bank. So firstly, the fact that our government may be following the same bad policies of other Western jurisdictions is not a reason to say, things could not be better. Actually, they can be better. And I think Australia is a good example of where they, because I'm not sure I agree with you that Australia will get to the sort of UK and US sorts of levels of inflation. I'm also not convinced that we couldn't. Now, experts came out to say today 7.3, we may be reaching the apex of the inflationary curve. I'm not convinced. I think the conditions for greater levels of inflation still exist, and we can have a chat in about 6 to 9 months' time to see who's right there. But I do agree with you that the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has acted, in my view, too slowly to manage inflation back down. And the things that they're seeing now with the official cash rate going up will have an effect, but as I say, it could take 18 months to come through. I was on the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee last year, and we heard from Adrian Orse in successive monetary policy statements projecting that, at that time it was 2.7%, that he reckoned it was going to be transitory and low, basically outside the 1 to 3% range, but nevertheless short term, and we'd get back into that range. We're not, and they're now telling a different story. I think the OCR should have gone up higher sooner.
Yep.
But as I said at the start, I think that's basically, we're looking over our shoulder, and to be fair to the Reserve Bank, they're also acting now, seeing the sorts of pressures and 2 or 3 successive quite significant increases in the official cash rate have happened. The last thing I'd say about the Reserve Bank, though, is that the government made it very clear that inflation was not their only problem to solve. They specifically gave them employment and maximum sustainable employment as a specific goal of the Reserve Bank. And many economic commentators will say that they are somewhat incompatible in the short term. One does have to give way to the other. And so if we have had that overcooked employment market, then that was going to have an inflationary pressure that the Reserve Bank were going to struggle to contain. That was true. Now, the question then becomes is, in their efforts to contain inflation, will that result in a higher level of unemployment? Probably at the margins, yes. But if you're going to do the interest rate controls, increasing them to control inflation, now is the best time to do it, when we've got a really overcooked economy and high demand for labour, so that if somebody is unfortunate enough to lose their job, they are most likely to be able to walk into another one pretty quickly.
Nicola Willis was talking this morning. I guess he was doing the rounds, but on one of the TV shows about, and I mean, it's a phrase that we're hearing from national MPs at the moment about, this government being addicted to spending, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and talking about spending less. I mean, that means cuts or to cancel future spending. What would you guys do? I mean, what needs to be taken away?
Yeah.
In other words, what spending would you take away that the government's either doing now or is projected to do?
Well, so firstly, I don't accept the portrayal of what we are saying. It doesn't mean cuts. What the government may say is cuts in real terms, which means that inflation is so out of control now that to maintain spending in real terms, they're going to have to increase all public spending by at least 7.3%. So firstly, we get inflation under control. Therefore, that pressure is not as high. But secondly, there are a number of areas of spending where we can avoid them. I think we've seen 15,000 extra public servants in Wellington. The only place where rents aren't or house prices aren't dropping in the way they are around the country is in Wellington, because CBD, because there's such a high demand for that property. And a lot of that's being driven by bureaucrats. Now, just to give you a simple example, the New Zealand Transport Authority has gone from about 1,200 to about 1,700 staff. Very little output for that. The Ministry of Health, at a time when they're actually being dismantled and turned into a policy unit, they've gone from 1,200 to 1,900 staff.
Sorry, not to interrupt you. Can I just ask you a quick question? I don't want to interrupt.
Yep, sure.
But when you say there's no outcome, I mean, Mr. Luxon has said that quite a bit about the health system.
Yep.
And then the government has come back and say, well, look at all these markers. When you say that, what are your metrics for saying?
Well, what are those markers? Okay. Because our metrics are people and people getting care, right? Now, we believed in the key English government, we were of the view in health, for example, that outputs were correlated with outcomes. If you have higher levels of immunization of our children, where they went from 63 to 92%, then that can be correlated with better outcomes in terms of the likelihood that they're going to get those diseases, particularly diseases of poverty. If you immunize against rheumatic fever, if you make homes warmer and drier, which we did under the Warm Up New Zealand Heat Smart program, then you're going to have lower levels of those sorts of diseases of low income. If you have people waiting in the emergency department for less than 6 hours, you're going to save about 700 lives a year. If you start cancer treatment within 4 weeks of a definitive diagnosis, the likelihood of an outcome is going to be better. So we had those markers. We had those targets. Now, the Labor government didn't like them. It said they were the wrong sorts of targets and they got rid of them. But what they didn't do was replace them with any quantifiable output or outcome measures. And as a consequence, in my view, the health sector has drifted. Despite a shed load of money going into it, we're having significant staffing shortages and we're having longer wait times, cancelled surgeries, some of which I do accept as part of COVID. Yeah. But the health system is under a tremendous amount of pressure, and in large part because they lack direction. Now, one of the things that we wouldn't be doing right now is a major restructure of the health system. We think this is tin-eared and poor timing.
Are you talking about DHBs coming into one?
Disappearing into one.
You'd leave the DHBs, that you'd let them operate as they're currently operating now. You wouldn't try and improve or not improve. You just leave them alone.
Yes, no, we would improve. There's no doubt, but this isn't the way. It seems to me that whatever the problem is, the answer is Wellington. And that's where we fundamentally disagree with the Labor Party and the left.
But what I hear you saying is that you're disagreeing on the way to do it. You want to improve it as well. You do it a different way from how they're wanting to improve it. So you're disagreeing not on the change, on the idea to change. You're disagreeing on how to change.
The need for some change in our health system was clear. Yeah. Throwing the whole model out and saying Wellington will control everything was not an answer that we would have come up with. Same with the polytechs. We have 16 polytechs around the country. 2 of them are the exemplars of academic and financial success. That's Otago Polytech and the Southern Institute of Technology. Instead of using them as the exemplars, this government spent $250 million merging them all together so that everybody can lose money, not just a few of them. I mean, that was really bad, a really bad idea. And so what worries me is there's a lot of money being spent on reform, but it's not reform that's actually improving outcomes. And that's part of the spending that we think can be avoided.
Would it be fair to say, and I'm actually not challenging you on that, you're entitled to say that, but would it be fair to say you won't know if they're improving outcomes in the Polytech one for several years because it's just happened? Would that be a fair thing to at least put out there?
Certainly, I would accept that a number of these major reforms would take some time to bed in. But what we wouldn't expect to see is a dramatic shift backwards in the sort of things that are happening. So this is an example of, a justification for the health reforms. But actually, we've spent 4.5 years drifting backwards in terms of those key measures of the health of New Zealanders. And then to then go, right, the solution to that is more reform, the biggest structural reform we've had in the health sector in probably 40 years, much less 20. We wouldn't expect, while we may not see all of the benefit, we shouldn't be seeing the interim harm that I think is being caused to things like waiting times for important treatments.
Right. Obviously 7.3 today for inflation. Do you have an idea? Like it's a bit of a silly question, but I'm talking about like I love radio and I love radio ratings. And we had a conversation around Today FM last week, and it was like I was saying to some of the guys, "What would you be happy with? What percentage for your first survey would you be happy with? What do you think would be, looking at the world at the moment and acknowledging that there's some things the government can't do? What do you think would be a fair inflation rate, like that National would be going, hey, this is pretty good? What would that number be for you guys, like right now?
Well, it would be at the higher end of the 1 to 3% rate for domestic inflation. Now, we
So hang on.
talked about.
So hang on. So you think fair would be about 3%? Like that would be you'd be National wouldn't be, would there be no peeps about it if it was at 3%, like nowhere else in the world at the moment?
Well, so firstly, you have to distinguish. I'll just go on and explain what I mean by that. Then we'll have that conversation. Because the RBNZ are judged not so much on the overall headline inflation number. And you may have heard over the last couple of days discussion being had about the difference between the tradable inflation and the non-tradable inflation. So generally non-tradable is the internal service sector, not exported, stuff like that. The tradable stuff is our imports, inflationary pressure on our imports. And that's the stuff that the government will say is not controllable. Well, in terms of the way we measure that, the 1 to 3% range that the RBNZ are judged on is judged on the domestic side, the non-tradable inflation.
So fuel wouldn't come into that.
We want to get under control first. And I think that's still achievable. It's their legal range. It's the obligation the Reserve Bank Act requires them in the long run to achieve. And I think we can. But as I say, that's probably going to take 18 months. And it's going to take a couple of things. It's going to take controls on spending, either increases in the supply of the products or decreases in demand for them, products and labor, and the government to taper off its crazy spending program right now. When those three things happen in an 18 months time frame, I think we can get non-tradable inflation back to that 3% range. Now, I'm a little bit more maudlin on that. I don't see that happening. While experts are saying that our overall inflation rate is probably peaking up around the 7 and mid sevens, I don't know if the conditions don't exist that mean we might not follow the UK and the US into higher territory.
I'm just Googling as you're talking because I don't know what the tradable inflation rate is. So what is that domestic inflation rate in New Zealand at the moment? So not the 7.3.
5.3, I think 5.4. So it was lower than the headline number.
So if you'd like to work a couple of percentage points off. So if the overall inflation, including what the international thing was about what Australia is now, National would be quite happy with that.
Yes. Well, no. Well, what I'll say is if what could also happen, which the government wouldn't be able to take credit for because they certainly haven't, they've used this as the defense, is, if things do settle down in the Ukraine, if oil supplies and grain supplies start to level off, if our shipping comes back to the level of capacity that we had pre-COVID, if COVID goes away, if all of those things happen, then we'll probably get back to a headline inflation number, probably over 3, but not that much over 3. I mean, there's a lot of variables in that, but the point is what the government controls, it should be doing more about.
So when you say headline, just to make sure, headline is including the international, not just the trade. That's right. Okay. Yep. So, and then this is a silly thing, and don't worry, it's not. I'm not being for real here, Michael. But we're both Dunedinites and we live locally. And let's say you guys get in next year, and you guys are the government.
Yeah.
At what point am I allowed to say to you in our conversation when you come on again? Now, you said to me looking for around that 3 to 4% headline. At what point am I able to hold you accountable to that after you get in next October-ish?
Probably between 18 months and 2 years after we're able to make the sort of decisions that we should be making. Okay. And that would probably include the first budget. So let's start the clock at budget 2024.
Okay.
And then, it is a long game, and we could be having a conversation probably in the last quarter of 2025 when we should be saying, right, government spending is under control. The Reserve Bank is taking a more normative approach to monetary policy. I was going to say loosened immigration policy. I don't think that's what we're talking about. and as a former Minister of Immigration of nearly 5 years, I'm pretty tuned in with this. When we have immigration policy that's calibrated to demand, so when demand drops, immigration drops. When demand increases, immigration increases. At the same time as we train and recruit as many Kiwis as we can and give them a reason to stay in New Zealand. When we've got those things happening, I think you'll see a much more stable and steady inflation picture.
So just to wrap up, thank you for giving us some time tonight. Really appreciate it talking to you. Hopefully we'll be able to talk again in the future. What I hear you saying is we're not doing cuts. We're just not going to adjust to inflation the amount we're spending like Labor is.
Yeah, that's pretty much your summary.
Okay, so that therefore means that some things may go backwards, because if you're not keeping up with inflation, they may not keep up with that. That's fair, and that's so it's not you're saying it's not a cut, but it's not keeping up with that same spending. So you'd spend less.
And in challenged economic times, we've done that before with significantly positive outcomes.
Yep.
But I think the key to that is to set very clear expectations for outcomes in health, in educational achievement, in law and order, in repeat violent offending, the sorts of things that we saw between 2008 and 2017, or at least in the first 6 years of those. We were able to do quite a bit with pretty meager increases in the various votes. So, and you could take them. So some's not controllable, like social welfare, obviously, to the degree that we don't control the number of people who retire at the age of 65. Obviously, We've talked about raising that. But broadly speaking, if we increase spending, but not by the rate that Labor would, and we'll never win a spending contest with Labor, then the other side of that coin is to be able to say, okay, we want you to do more with the funds that you get, and here are the objective measures of success for that. We'll be ruthless about that.
When you say spend more with the funds that you get, I mean, on some level, that does relate me to a couple of little wrap-ups for us. Is I think Nicola Willis talked about, or the article I'm reading on stuff says National wants tax cuts. That's that same policy of tax cuts. Now, normally with tax cuts, I guess what you're saying is if you don't spend the same amount as Labor's going to spend, that's absorbable, because normally with tax cuts, if you're going to spend the same amount, you therefore need to cut elsewhere or borrow. So are you cutting, i.e. this not spending that inflation, or are you borrowing to pay for these tax cuts?
Well, the question, and I don't want to assume this is your view, but the question could be interpreted as saying if tax cuts occur, then by necessity the government has less in the coffers. I contest that. Tax cuts generally go to three things. People either retire debt, save it, or spend it. And the sorts of tax threshold changes that we are talking about will be targeted very much at the people who are most likely to spend it, not save it. So that does have a stimulatory effect on the economy. That means the government actually gets income back from that. The biggest beneficiaries, by the way, of the situation we have at the moment are the Treasury and the Minister of Finance, who've taken billions of dollars of extra tax in because of the inflationary environment we find ourselves in. So, but the tax threshold changes are not necessarily a net cost on the Crown. By the way, it's your money. Right, so when you pay it, you should expect from your government that it only takes as little as possible from you in order to be able to maintain the services. The last thing I would say about that is in the spending side. I'll tell you a story that will illustrate the point. When I was Minister of Police in 2015, we opened a collaboration with Vodafone, and we gave police mobile devices. First time that all had iPhones and iPads. And then through a development hub in Newtown and Wellington, they developed things that prevented sworn officers on the beat from having to go back to their stations and write tickets and write reports and do a pile of paperwork that they had previously needed to do. That initiative saved 1.2 million hours of police time every year. That's the equivalent of putting 600 sworn officers on the beat, which is exactly how the dividend was paid. They didn't lose money, they gained hours. Now, that's just one small example of how smart government, smart public policy, actually gets a better outcome for the taxpayer. This idea that the only way to get good out is to pour lots of money in, I think needs to be challenged. And when Andrew Little said that last year, I don't know why the health sector isn't doing better. We've put so much money in. For me, illustrates the point. Government's harder than just money. If it was as simple as that, we'd have solved it years ago. It actually needs a smart government sector, public sector, thinking about innovative ways to do better with the money that they get.
Listen, I've from this last 3 minutes, there's about another hour I want to talk to you about. So maybe we can book in to have a chat because in the future, because you talked about, giving tax cuts to those who need it most. But, when those were, not that they were announced, it's not a policy, but, I remember some uncomfortable conversations with Mr. Luxon about how much he'd get back in his pocket versus, a beneficiary. And it seems that the majority of the money was going to people who didn't need to spend it as opposed to those who did. But I guess I don't really want to, that would be another 40-minute conversation, Michael, and I don't want to hold you up for
I'd love to have as a licensed accountant. I have very strong views about that. And, in a progressive tax system, the reality is you can't give a tax cut to everyone without giving it to people who pay the most and earn the most. So we'll have that conversation another day.
Well, I mean, you could, in theory. You could, in theory, you could choose to not change it for the top rate if you want to. I'm not suggesting anyone would do that, but in theory, you could do that. It's possible.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
It depends what you mean by the top rate, because
rates.
Yeah, I mean,
like if you only gave it to people earning under 30, like literally only gave it to people earning under, say, $50,000, then you wouldn't be giving it to the top earners. I mean, you'd be giving it to the first 50,000 they earned, but you wouldn't be giving them to the higher thresholds.
But the problem with that, Pat, is that every single income earner earns that first $50,000.
Sure.
So because of the progressive tax system we have, you are giving a tax cut to people who earn a lot more money than maybe you and I do. So
and look, and I'm not suggesting that's what any political party would do.
That's a whole other conversation I look forward to having.
Yeah. Finally, so you've mentioned 2 to 20 times in this conversation, just joking, about the number of bureaucrats going up. So we can expect National to cut back on the number of bureaucrats, or will you leave it as it is and there'll be a natural attrition? Or will there be 15,000 in, so those people get their CVs ready?
I don't think we would lose that many, but I don't think I'm convinced we can run Wellington on fewer than we've got now.
And the final question is, you've talked about rent several times. Mr. Luxon was asked about this a couple of months ago. We've been doing this for about 3.5 months now. I was right back at the start when he said $50 a week. I think it's more like $100 a week now. It's jumped up that much in that time period. And he was asked then something that I want to ask you now, which is, acknowledging that it's gone up, what would you then do to either reduce that rate, that rent, or I guess enable the person to earn another $50 to $100 a week so it offsets their rent? What would
the policy will be developed next year, but we will be looking at easing some of the things that we believe drove rental increases from landlords last year and this year. And one of the significant ones was the Bright Line test going out to 10 years, which is effectively the capital gains tax that the Prime Minister said she would resign before she did. Well, given that most houses are flipped in 7 years, that means a significant portion of all houses that aren't the first home are going to be subject to a marginal capital gains tax. So remember that most countries around the world only have a 15% or so capital gains. For many landlords, that would be 33 or 39%. So it's much more punitive than the countries with whom the Labor government compared and said we wouldn't do that. If a landlord is looking for a rate of return, there's 2 ways they can do that. It's either on capital growth or on income. If they can't get it from capital growth, it's going to be on income. And effectively, that the capital framework we had was subsidising rents. That subsidy was removed, in my view, by the imposition of the capital gains tax the government put in through the Bright Line test, and rents went up.
All right, listen, I can feel us. We'll have to get together and have a coffee one day somewhere around Dunedin and keep going. But I'd love to talk to you again within the next, 12 months. It's great to have you on. It's good to have your perspective. I do appreciate you giving us some time. The Honourable Michael Woodhouse. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Pleasure. Thanks, mate.